So hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here. Really excited to be having this conversation and always excited when leaders in the space, such as Danny and Nicole, come together to create programs such as this. So really thrilled that this is happening and very happy to be involved. My name is David Cash. I run an agency called Cash Labs. We call ourselves an innovation communications agency. But what we mean by that essentially is we help typically brands, mainly Fortune 500 and publicly traded companies, harness and utilize new technologies. So I know that sounds quite vague. My background specifically is I ran a production company for about 7 years, a traditional production company. We did work ranging from, Vogue covers to Netflix shows, all kinds of stuff in the more traditional entertainment media space. And then during the pandemic, all of our gigs went away. This is obviously an oversimplification. But I ended up going back to school and pursuing a master's degree. And at the same time, I was spending all my time on my phone on Clubhouse, and one thing led to another, and I fell down the rabbit hole and fell in love with NFTs just as a concept. And really, my first love in terms of NFTs were NFTs applied to fashion. I was having a lot of conversations around how can the fashion industry use, decentralized systems and NFT technology to improve processes that currently exist. And one thing led to another, and I actually petitioned my school to write a master's thesis about NFTs. And they looked at me like I was crazy because I was going to school in Italy and nobody had ever brought that up before. This was in 2020. But I convinced them, and I ended up writing a master's thesis on the topic of NFTs and on the topic of decentralization as an anthropological device is what I called it. But essentially, what I meant by that was, applications of NFT technologies. What do these technologies look like when applied to virtual fashion, to the metaverse, to tokenizing land, to tokenizing real estate, all of these kinds of use cases, which are now more relevant and talked about kind of in the context of Web3. So I was kind of talking about that in 2020, and I released that thesis on the internet, and that's how I started Cash Labs. I just put this out online, and all of a sudden I started having a ton of people reaching out to me, asking me, okay, how do we use NFTs in our business? How do we create something with NFTs? How do we, integrate these technologies into what we have going on? And lucky for me, I had 7 years of kind of commercial production background, so I had a lot of confidence in terms of producing activations, producing campaigns, rolling out initiatives. So I just kind of started, and Cash Labs really started with just me, and I hired an assistant because when I got back home from Italy from school, I had 100,000 emails that I had to go through from people who were reaching out, who read my thesis, because it just kind of went out on the internet. And I started responding, and that started with me working with a lot of amazing people who are now very well known in the Web3 space, NFT artists like Krista Kim, Justin Aversano, Don Diablo, and very soon that evolved into me working with more, traditional celebrities, people like Paris Hilton. I'll give Don the traditional celebrity status as well. Paris Hilton, Deadmau5, these types of people, French Montana, these types of people who were entering the space at that time. And that kind of continued on a trajectory until about 20, do we have we do have the stream as well. We can go to the next slide as well, or the slide afterwards while I'm talking about all this if you want. That's Cash Labs. So this is how we started all of this, this entity that is Cash Labs today. And it's a little bit slow, but here, go to the next slide. Go to the next slide while I'm talking about this, if that's okay. So since then, we've really been working to produce a range of activations. I'd say for that first year, we were doing what I call drinking from the fire hose. We had a ton of people reaching out. We were very interested in the space. We wanted to explore all of these different applications and use cases, and we really did everything that we possibly could. So over the past 2.5 years, this company is only 2.5 years old. We produced over 200 activations, projects, drops, etc. I really mean drinking from the fire hose. That's how I contextualize it. Fall of 2020. I was in Miami for Art Basel, and I had an in-person meeting with Sam Hamilton, who's the creative director of Decentraland. And I'd activated in Decentraland before. You'll see some little clips from it in here. But we had a conversation around, what does a fashion event look like in the metaverse? And I'd previously produced some fashion activations. At the very beginning of the pandemic, I worked with our fashion week here in Toronto to produce one of the first official digital fashion weeks, just filming and live streaming shows, which is now very commonplace. So we were having this conversation about what does that look like, in this context. And so one thing led to another, and I worked with Decentraland to kind of conceptualize and produce the first Metaverse Fashion Week in Decentraland. So that was a big shift for us as well. You'll see some little clips from different things in here as well. But that was a big shift for us because I think very much as a company and as myself, we very much moved away from our initial approach, which was just kind of saying yes to everything, to really learning, I think, which projects and which activations had the most impact in terms of, data, but also in terms of social impact, like where did we see the most conversion, where did we see the most onboarding, et cetera. And we really saw that there were certain activations that we helped produce or that we were working on. We always use it as an example, but like such as the Estee Lauder activation that we did, which there's a clip of it here. I think it's right here, actually. Yeah, this Estee Lauder activation that we did during Metaverse Fashion Week. When we kind of analyzed a lot of the data from that event, we learned that the brands that were most effective in terms of bringing their audiences in versus the brands that were activating existing audiences that were already spending time in those worlds were very different. And the ways that they went about communicating to their audiences were very different. So we very much, used that data and shifted our business model to try to replicate some of these situations. I mean, this event on paper was very successful. We had over 1.2 billion unique media impressions, over 100,000 people attended, and this first event was just in Decentraland. So if you can think about, in terms of statistics, having over 100,000 people attend something in Decentraland in 4 days is absurd, at least in the grand scheme of things. But really, I think, there were certain brands like Estee Lauder who were able to, out of those 1.2 billion people who saw it via media, they were able to, get 900 million people's attention, for instance. They were able to convert, they sold out all of the, they had all of their POAPs were claimed. All of their wearables were claimed. They had some of these statistics, and they actually had conversion statistics as well, that their audiences from their social media platforms and their existing consumers of these products were actually buying and engaging with these, activities. So did a lot of data analytics and very much shifted our business model away from, I guess, this drinking from the fire hose mentality to how do we work with these types of brands, these pervasive companies that, really have the public's attention and already sell people things that they want, really high level. How do we work with them and how do we onboard their audiences and use these technologies to benefit their consumers in real ways? So since then, this is where I have to speed up because most of what we've done since then is very much under NDA and most of it's very top secret, which is good and bad, building in private. But since then, we've been really focused on working with a lot of these really large companies, the Fortune 10s of the world, what have you. Some of them we've done things publicly with, such as Farfetch, or other brands of that respect, the NBA, for instance. But most of what we're doing at the moment we can't talk about. These are multi-year projects where we're trying to integrate these types of technologies into companies' frameworks in really meaningful ways. So not just onboarding 5 or 6 artists to do a collection, but how do we integrate Web3 into the fabric of an ecosystem? So a lot has changed. We do a lot of things. We keep very busy, but I think at the core of everything that we're working on right now and why I'm really excited to be here talking to you guys right now is in order for all of these things that I'm talking about, all these big words, all these conceptual topics, which I'm assuming also that we have a lot of level set in this room. Like I'm assuming that also we have a general understanding to a certain degree, and I'm going to ask you guys about that in a second. But generally speaking, I think as an industry, what I'm really focused on and what I'm really passionate about right now is trying to get us all on the same page, have us all sharing a similar narrative. And I don't believe that it's sharing a specific narrative as in a manufactured narrative. When we go through this presentation, and you'll see what I mean by this, I really do think a lot of the things that I'm pushing and I'm talking about and the way I'm contextualizing it is the way that things are going to play out over the next few years. And it's not just me saying this is all very research based. So with all that being said, if we can go to the next slide, I would love to take a moment. That's a little bit about who I am. I do a lot of other things that I can talk about too. I write a tech column for Vogue. I teach at a bunch of different universities. But what I'd really love to know for a moment, if we can even take 5 minutes out of this hour, is if everybody in the room right now or anybody who's comfortable to do so would be willing to just quickly say hi and let me know in 10 or 15 seconds, just like, hi, my name is, and I'm a student at this, or I run this company. I would just love to know if it's okay with the team, if I could just know, I guess, who's with us today. And then I'll do my best to cater this conversation as much as possible to you guys as well. So what's the best way to do this? Anybody want to just say hi?
Hi.
Hello.
Oh.
Hello.
Oh.
Hi.
Hello. Can I get everybody just like anybody who's willing to say hi? Just say hi. My name is, and this is what I do.
Hi. My name is Jessica. My handle is Isadoska because that's my company name. But I'm a digital fashion designer with a background in biodesign from St. Martin's. Really excited to be here.
That's a perfect example of exactly what I want to hear. So thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Hi,
Fabulous.
my name is Joyce Adai Davis, and I am a physical footwear designer graduate from Royal College of Art, and I specialize in gravity sketch 3D modeling.
Amazing. We need you all. Fabulous.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Johnny. Yeah. So I'm Johnny. I'm mainly I work with generative art. So I am like a creative coder, but yeah, I have no actually formal education in neither like coding nor fashion.
That's fine. That's awesome. Generative art is super critical to this. Fabulous.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a generative artist, and I'm dropping an NFT today, by the way. So, hi.
Hello. Nice to meet you. I see a couple familiar faces too.
Hi,
Hi,
I'm
Sorry.
go ahead. Sorry.
Just go. Creative confidence is a good practice.
All right. Hello. My name is Decentralized. I'm a metaverse architect at Digital Forger Workshop. Have no
Awesome.
background of fashion, only doing avatars and yeah. So excited. Thank you.
Sweet. Nice to meet you.
Hi, my name is Céline Chen. I'm a traditional fashion designer, but also a digital one. And I studied before philosophy, choreography, and fashion marketing and fashion design. And I'm really glad to be part of the residency. So I can't wait to learn more about your course. So thank you.
Français, Canadien, Suisse? Français, Canadien, Suisse? Where are you from?
Français,
Ah, très bien.
French. I'm French.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, fabulous, fabulous.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm a physical fashion designer turned digital and freelance. I teach and I work with museums mostly.
Fabulous. A very worthwhile endeavor right now. All museums need to be digitized. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi there, David. I am Gremiana Gonzalez. I'm a graphic design student and I'm a 3D generalist and also digital sculptor. And I'm currently making explorations towards digital fashion and learning more about it. Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Hi, David. Kay here. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, I come from a traditional fashion background. I'm based in Tokyo, and I worked with a fabricant for a year and a half, and very excited to be here and super excited to hear your talk. Thank you.
So happy you're here. Lovely to see you. Amazing. Anybody else want to say hi? If not, maybe we'll kick off, but I would love to hear from anybody else who's here. I can only see 4 of you.
Again, go ahead.
I'll go quick. Hi, my name is Coco. I'm based in Mexico City. I'm about to launch a new brand called Cincio in about a couple weeks.
Sweet.
And I'm also a biocultural conservationist. I'm very excited to be here and to listen to your chat. Thank you.
So cool. I'll be in Mexico City in a month and a half. I'll reach out afterwards.
Amazing. Yeah.
Cool.
I will be very quick, I promise. Nice to meet you, David. I'm Marcela. I'm a digital fashion designer. I work for a production house, basically doing avatar creation, digital clothes, mainly focused on VR experiences.
Amazing.
Hi,
Hi,
I'm Jane.
David. Nice to meet you. Oh, oh, go ahead.
Oh
Go
no,
ahead.
Either
after you go.
Yeah, hi David, nice to meet you. My name is Victoria and I come from a traditional fashion background and for a few years have been working solely in digital fashion.
Cool. Fabulous. Nice to meet you.
Hi,
Janie, please.
I'm Tamara Kari Jane Umkur. I'm a digital fashion designer and freelance fashion illustrator with a background in new skins and wearable technology from IED Madrid. And I'm currently based in Nigeria, also in the process of starting my fashion brand. So yeah.
So cool. Yeah, you are. Amazing. I love this. Anybody else? I'm so excited to be talking with all of you. I think this is a great group of people. So this is also helpful for me in terms of level setting, because I don't want to necessarily like, I'll mention some things, but I don't need to talk your ear off about like what is XR, you know. So yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else? If not, I'll kick off. But this is great. Ooh, I see a green eye. Micah, I'm not sure if we can hear you, or at least maybe it's just me. It's very muffled. I'm sorry. Do you want to just quickly say hi in the chat? Is that really annoying to ask? Is that okay? Because if this is your makeup look, it's absolutely fabulous. So, and I see Elena also wrote, my microphone doesn't work today. I'm Elena, physical fashion designer, and I teach design at Edinburgh College of Art and do my own freelance work. Fabulous, fabulous. Comes from underwater. Oh gosh. Well, we're trying. Yeah, Micah, Misha, if you want to just quickly say hello in the chat, I will read it out. But as we're getting that started, perhaps we'll go to the next slide. If anybody else, you're a mermaid of sorts. Ooh, okay, I'm excited to learn more. If anybody else wants to say hi, please feel free to do so in the chat. And also at the very end, if we'll have some time for Q&A. So if anybody else wants to say hi, mention anything specific, I would love that. Very much want to learn more about all of you and what you're doing. I think this is the ecosystem to me is like the most important part of all of this. So yeah, we can move to the next slide and start this this rant of mine. So yeah, the first thing I always like to talk about when we're talking about any of these conversations, like based on today's conversation, and like one of the things that I also highly recommend, I am going to read it because I'm not going to slow us down. Wait. Remember, I come from an electronic art background and I'm very active in the Tezos ETH world. Very cool. Very cool. Fabulous. I love both the Tezos and ETH worlds. I've been active in both. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of hypermodernity. And this is actually something, I know this seems like a very like, I don't know, conceptual, very academic word, but it is actually something that I recommend that we bring up as much as possible to as many people as possible right now. Again, a little bit preaching to the choir, but hypermodernity, really high level in terms of how I like to understand it and how I like to explain it, is essentially just describing the phenomena that we've reached a point in history right now where technology is developing at a rate that is difficult for humans to understand. And I think we can all agree on this. You know, if we look at the exponential progression of technology, it's only sped up. You know, the mental leap for somebody to understand the evolution from a horse and carriage to that idea of that horse and carriage maybe being able to move without a horse is a way smaller, you know, mental gap than the concept of, okay, one day we're speaking to each other via pen and paper, and then the next day we have a digital device and we're speaking on the other side of the world. Like, that's already a huge mental gap. So I think one of the things I always like to talk about is when we have a lot of these conversations about digital fashion, Web3, the metaverse, XR, AR, any of these technologies, AI especially right now is what everybody's talking about. A lot of companies will take one of two approaches. Either they're looking at this as in, oh, I don't get that. That's too much for me. My kid plays that. I'm not interested. Like, they completely disregard, which to me is an example of hypermodernity. Or they productize it and they try to make it just kind of a buzzwordy thing. Like they think it's another like influencer product, or they think it's another, you know, pop socket. They're like, oh, we need to do an AI project because we need a marketing, you know, buzz project. We need a marketing buzzworthy project. And that's also, I think, an example of hypermodernity where a company doesn't try to understand a technology, they just try to do something with it because it's cool. So I think a lot of the time when we're talking about all these new technologies, I like to consider them within the context of hypermodernity, because I think also when we're having conversations with brands, I know somebody said museums, when we're having conversations with any type of institution, ranging from a government to a hospital to a fashion brand, I think a big thing is they're saying, oh, well, why would we do this now versus next year versus 5 years from now? I think a lot of the conversation, and I'm going to dive into this on a lot of different levels, but a lot of the conversation right now is, if we don't start developing content in 3D, if we don't start, you know, creating content that would be native to an XR environment, let alone an AR environment or a game world environment, these companies are going to be behind in a very, very short period of time. And I think just, you know, level setting for the industry and making, you know, as many people as possible understand that if we think things are moving fast now, oh, just wait. Like, just give us 2 years and the entire ecosystem is going to change once again, as it has continued to. So that's the first thing that I always like to talk about when we're considering this. Then if we can go to the next slide. When we start dialing in terms of today's conversation and in terms of what we're all here talking about, you know, when we're talking about digital fashion, we can just go to the next slide, the metaverse. yeah, we're talking about a few different things here. So one of them I like to talk about is considering the metaverse versus Web3. Like when we're thinking about this ecosystem where digital fashion, one of the reasons that this residency exists, where digital fashion lives in, to me, this is very much the metaverse. And if you want to go to the next slide, because this will be just going through a few. So if you want to go to the next slide, right now, and again, I'm probably saying these statistics that you guys know, so I'm just going to gloss through them. Every day, 3 billion people, 3.04 billion people play a video game. And every day, 1.408 billion people through specifically TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram use an AR filter every day. So what this means statistically is that over 50% of the world is engaging in the metaverse, the digital world, every day. And I think that's the biggest definition shift that we really need to work on here together, because the metaverse is a term that has been coined-ish, or at least proverbially coined, by Meta and by Zuckerberg and by Facebook, to the extent that I have had conversations with Fortune 500 companies that you would be so surprised by. I can't say because it would be blasphemous if I mentioned the types of companies who I've had conversations with. I mentioned something like Metaverse Fashion Week, or I mentioned the metaverse, and they think I'm talking about Meta. They think that because Meta has very much, decided to own this word, this context. So I think what's really important when we're considering the metaverse, when we're talking about the metaverse, is to bring it back to its original definition, to bring it back to some of these original contexts, and really start considering the metaverse as all digital contexts when considered together. What does it look like to blend the worlds of gaming, AR, VR, etc.? There's a ton of digital context that we live in today, and we spend so much time in them. And I really want us to all, that was Zuck's idea, own the name. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the problem is, since he's kind of done away with the core product of his company being the metaverse, it's put this industry almost in a little bit of a limbo. I mean, I think we all remember when anything metaverse related, shot up in price. I remember when my Decentraland coins 5x. I was like, oh my God. But that's also feeding back into the hype cycle. That's also an example, I think, of hypermodernity and people just kind of like riding a trend without trying to actually do anything or provide any kind of value. And I think that's super problematic. But going back to this concept of the metaverse, when we consider this, this idea that over 50% of the world is spending time in a digital context every day, spending time in the metaverse, when considering it the way that I like to consider it, every day. If we go to the next slide, what that also means is that 50+% of the world is wearing digital fashion today. We're just not calling it digital fashion. We're calling it a Snapchat filter. We're calling it a game skin. Just because you have an orc and it's raiding a castle doesn't mean it's not wearing a fur coat. Somebody designed that fur coat. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here because a lot of you are the people who are doing that. But I really want the industry and the world, and especially the public, to start considering all of these different applications and all of these different wearable applications as digital fashion. So I think that's one of the big things, when we're talking about Web3, the metaverse, all of these things, I think we sometimes move away from where people are and what they're doing, because I think we can really ground all of this and base it in really relevant human actions that are prevalent today. And I think, again, when we go back to this idea of hypermodernity, when we consider this, a lot of people's immediate response will be like, oh, well, my kids play video games. I don't play video games. Okay, but do you have a phone? Have you engaged in an e-commerce experience? Is a more immersive e-commerce experience, inherently more interesting, or would keep you there for longer than just a basic e-commerce experience? People aren't really considering this as an ecosystem. They're considering it in very specific examples, and usually through a third party. So anyway, that's my little mini rant. We can move on from there if we want to go to the next slide. So this is going back to one of my core elements. So when we're considering the metaverse today, when we're considering digital fashion today, and when we're talking about this, a lot of us are considering the metaverse as Web3 game worlds. When we think about the metaverse, the first thing that comes to mind is Decentraland. The first thing that comes to mind is spatial. But what the gap that I really want to close a lot of people here are already well beyond this, but the gap that I really want to close for brands, and the reason I'm pushing this as part of the conversation right now, is I really, really believe that in order for us to start moving, and I'm going to talk about this more in these coming slides as well, but in order for us to start moving towards the very near future, which is about to come upon us, where XR technologies are about to be not only available, but eventually relevant. Just to add a little precursor to this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, I don't personally believe that the Apple Vision Pro will be the consumer headset and that by January of next year, every single person globally is going to be engaging in XR experiences. I don't necessarily believe that. But that being said, I think it's the kickoff. And being somebody who's already had some conversations with, other Fortune 500 companies, I think the space race in terms of this XR future is very much upon us. In the next literally 2 to 5 years, we're going to have to start considering how to blend these AR worlds and these game worlds. And I don't see any problem with us pushing forwards and developing both of them wholeheartedly. But I do believe on the brand level, on the platform level, on the design level, we really have to start considering how do both of these types of experiences move towards a more extended reality experience. So just moving on from there for a couple slides, I'm going to come back to this XR conversation in a moment, but I just want to really quickly talk about Web3 in terms of this conversation, because I think, so if we can go to the next slide. I really just want to quickly talk about Web3 in terms of this conversation, because I think, again, when we're thinking big picture, when we're thinking context, a lot of people use Web3, and I'm also guilty of this, I have to be honest. A lot of people use Web3 as the blanket term for this entire ecosystem. And I think also one thing that's been slightly problematic in terms of when folks like us are explaining these types of concepts to brands is, we'll use Web3 as a catch-all term, and we'll include the metaverse in terms of our understanding of a metaverse like Decentraland in this definition of Web3. So this is a core piece that I really like to kind of take out of the equation, because I do think that despite the fact that I personally, I think most of the people in this room fundamentally believe in blockchain technology and the rationale of why would we like to decentralize our data and decentralize ownership, period. I don't think that this aspect is inherently tied to the concept of digital spaces. And I think that that's something we need to disconnect, at least in terms of how we consider both of these things right now. Because if we're thinking about these things in terms of the definitions that I'm providing, the metaverse is really specifically, we were told by a couple speakers already to avoid talking Web3 NFT due to strong rejection client-wise. Do you agree? Partially. I'll talk through this a little bit, and I can answer that a little bit more specifically in a moment. But I think high level, when we're considering Web3, when you're considering a Web3 strategy, that doesn't necessarily have to include a metaverse. And similarly, when you're considering a metaverse strategy or an AR strategy or an XR strategy or a spatial computing strategy, because essentially they're all the same thing, we're just calling it different things, you don't necessarily have to include Web3 into that strategy. They're both elements. So what I mean by that, if we want to go to the next slide, so what do I mean when I'm talking about Web3 if I'm not talking about this? What am I talking about? We can, just one next slide. Fabulous. So what is Web3? And I have this under the with the background of an NFT that I own from my friend Krista Kim. So here we go. Very, very Web3, right? So what is Web3? When we're talking to brands specifically, to answer your question about Web3, all that I'm talking about and all that I mean is the core idea of decentralizing ownership. Are we going to sell this through a third party? Or are we going to sell this ourselves? If we're going to be selling this ourselves, ownership makes a lot of sense. So let me give you a couple examples. And again, I'm preaching to the choir for many of you. The generative artists who make NFTs here very much already have heard this a million times. But I really believe when brands are considering this, I can talk a lot about the benefits of NFTs, and I can talk a lot about the benefits of tokenizing assets just in general. But I think on a very, very high level, brands have to think about things like their content, things like their products, things like ownership. Are they going to be sharing that content, those products, etc., through a third party, through a Meta, through an Amazon, through a Google, or are they going to be pushing to produce and distribute, etc., independently? I think if they're going to be pushing anything independently, it inherently makes sense to tokenize fashion and to prove ownership. So I think when I first fell in love with NFTs and the concept of NFTs, before when I started researching for my master's thesis, the first aha moment that I had, in terms of why would we take something and have a digital record of it stored on the blockchain? Why would we do that? Is when I started considering what the process currently is for the fashion system. So this is the next two slides. It's just talking about fashion on chain. So I think the first thing that I was thinking about when I first considered fashion and NFTs is, this came from a Clubhouse conversation I had, in 2020. But, I was listening to people talk about, when you buy a garment, you have so much stuff that is associated with that garment. Let's think traditional right now. You have so much stuff that's associated with that garment. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. What if your receipt, your CRM system, your card, like I've bought things at Prada and they've given me a physical card. You know, what if all of these different things, the washing instructions, the labels, the tags, what if all of these things could be encapsulated by one digital asset, and you could just store all this information and give it to the consumer as part of a a proof of ownership that they bought this garment and that it's theirs, and B, a repository of any amount of information that you'd like to keep. And then what if that that record of purchase was stored immutably on a blockchain that wasn't owned by the store or the person that would outlive both of them? Conceptually, that's lovely, and I think we're starting to see now a lot of applications of that kind of vision. We're seeing a lot of people integrate things like NFC chips into their clothing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's like the original kind of promise of like why NFTs and why fashion. I think when we take this a step further and we consider digital fashion, so I think that's the next slide, right? Yeah, let's go to the next slide. When we consider digital fashion and when we consider an asset that is purely digital, an NFT is kind of the only thing that makes sense in terms of storing it when you think purely conceptually. So this is where the Web3 piece fits in, and I'll answer your question as a part of this this slide. I think when we're considering a purely digital asset, so I always like to use the example of if you buy a gaming skin in Fortnite versus you buy a gaming skin in Decentraland or any metaverse that is Web3 enabled or has NFTs as a part of their ecosystem, you notice the difference immediately, because this is an even larger example of, are you trusting that game ecosystem to own your asset on your behalf, or are you, the brand, or you, the consumer, actually responsible for the ownership of that product? So, it's an example that has been mentioned many times, and I'm sure many people in this room already know this, but if a game crashes, and I think Fortnite's a bad example, some of these larger, ecosystem type games, they have a ton of resources, they have a ton of servers, they'll make things work. But if a smaller game crashes, or if, something becomes obsolete, or, a company goes bankrupt, and you've spent money on assets within that walled garden ecosystem, you will very quickly wish that you own those assets, ideally on the blockchain. So to go back and answer your question, when I'm talking to brands about tokenizing data or anything, I actually agree with some of the other previous mentors who've mentioned, like, don't necessarily contextualize it as Web3, don't necessarily call them NFTs. I think calling a digital asset an NFT is like calling an iPhone an iOS cloud computing device. To certain people, that makes a lot of sense. Like what you just said makes perfect sense. I understand. But to other people, you've lost them. So I think, when we're selling something as an NFT, if it is a digital artwork and you're selling it on Super Rare, I would be very confident selling that product as an NFT. But I think if you're trying to sell traditional or digital fashion to a consumer that otherwise does not have a crypto wallet, that otherwise, is not, ingratiated into this ecosystem, there still are ways to do that. There still is a way to do that. There still is a way to sell to those consumers and to push the benefits of Web3 enabled products without necessarily even saying the word NFT or without saying the word Web3. What I've been having a lot of success with, through my clients, is when we're talking about why would we store something on the blockchain, we're just talking about that as it's stored securely. Because again, it's overly technical if we go anywhere beyond that. If their CTO is on the call, or if they have developers on the call, we'll talk to them about the specifics. But usually the conversation goes like, how is this data being stored? We're storing it in a secure manner. What is the secure manner? We're using the blockchain. Oh, I don't know about the blockchain. I've heard that that's dangerous. Oh, well, we're using the Ethereum blockchain. And where do you currently store all your data? They'll be like, AWS. I'll be like, okay, well, about 50% of Ethereum is stored on AWS, but the other 50% isn't. So inherently it is more decentralized and on a high level, if we want to oversimplify, more safe. So this has really been the argument that we've been pushing to brands. I think the benefits of storing assets on chain are obvious, at least to me, and hopefully to many of you in this room. But I think the ask of brands to go through a full onboarding process is a lot. So just to show an example, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the connected commerce conversation. So we can go to the next slide. So I think here are two examples based on kind of what I just talked about, two examples of digital fashion that are NFTs. So the one on the left is an example of one that I might actually just put as a more traditional NFT. These are pants created by Artifact. I believe this was sold on Super Rare. If not, it was sold auction style. This was some years ago. But this is kind of the original vision, the original promise of some of this digital fashion, purely as an NFT offering. So this is very much an artwork. You can't wear this piece. It's not available in a video game. It is an artwork. It's an artistic representation. And the person who bought it because they love this as an artistic piece. So this is very much, I'd say, like the traditional notion of an NFT. The one on the right, this tuxedo, is a collaboration between the Fabricant and World of Women. And they did a co-creation project several years ago. Kay, I'm sure, is overly familiar with this project. But this is an example of an NFT asset that you're able to wear in-game. So this is also where we're taking this further. And I picked this asset purposely because I think it looks nice. But ultimately, most of these examples of in-game assets are not necessarily going to look like this. They're going to be contextualized per the game. It could be anything from a crown to a skin, right? But the idea that this digital asset has playable utility, I think, is really important when we're considering, why digitize this asset. And then again, to bring it into my example for the one or two people who may want me to, if I bought this asset in as an NFT, I own it forever. So Ready Player Me could essentially crumble as a company. Spatial could, change ownership, change its name, change ecosystems, but I would still own this asset. And I think that's the really core part. So for physical clothing, it makes sense to a certain degree. For digital clothing, I think it's necessary when we're having this conversation. So let's go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the physical aspect, because I think this is, the conversation that a lot of the brands are having now. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of connected commerce, and hopefully this is coming full circle for some of you. A lot of people have been talking about connected commerce to some respect for decades. This was previously talked about as IoT, or like Internet of Things, and this idea of connecting, physical goods together through a digital means. So this is not a new concept. I mean, Oracle and some of these companies have been really pushing this. If you go to a fashion school in Europe, I'm sure you've had some lecture on IoT or at some point in your adventures. But that being said, if we just go to the next slide, I think all that I want to talk about in terms of connected commerce as it relates to this conversation, especially Web3 and fashion, is just this idea of connected commerce to the extent of connecting a physical product with a digital experience. So I think this is one of the really core things that I'm pushing right now in terms of this ecosystem. Yes, we're very much moving towards, and it's the next and principal and last thing I'm going to speak about. Yes, we're moving towards an XR future, but I think the disconnect with a lot of the industry today, a lot of the brands that are working today, is that their goal is still to sell physical garments. High level, point blank period, right? Their goal is to still sell physical garments. So the question that a lot of these brands are asking is, how do we improve, extend, what have you, the experience of the consumer buying a physical product? How can we make them want to buy this product versus all the other products? We can have a whole conversation about the intangibility of luxury fashion and how to sell a fantasy and all these things. But really high level, what they would like when they're working with folks like us is, how do we connect a physical experience that we currently have in store, whether that's a product or whether that's an aspect of my retail experience, with a continued digital experience? How can we use that to create repeat purchases? How can we use that to increase customer retention? How can we use that to increase brand loyalty? These are the things that these types of brands are thinking about in this respect. So it is as simple as integrating an NFC chip into a garment sometimes, but it's what you do with that I think really matters when we're having these conversations. So yes, you can integrate. And there's a lot of lovely examples of this. I recommend, there's a million things that you can check out, but I recommend that people check out the company Solaire, Solaire. They're doing a really nice job, and I think some of you might be able to do this yourselves. Others should reach out to them or similar companies, but they're doing a really nice job of working from end to end, from physical product to digital experience. So for instance, in that example, you're able to scan an NFC chip on a garment. It'll bring you to a web page on your phone. On that web page, you're able to put in your email. It'll send you a confirmation code. By entering that code, you will have created a custodial wallet, and you will own, or you will have access to a digital version of that garment immediately. So this idea of bringing people from the physical to the digital experience, I think, is really important, especially when there's a tokenized version of the garment. And I'll send some of these resources afterwards, but I think there's a few people doing this really well. I'm sure most people here are familiar with 9DCC. I think Mintage, the Nick Adler, Sean Witherspoon company recently has done a really good job of this, as in I've tried it and it's worked, which is to me right now doing a very good job of this. I also do see, and I won't name names because it is a bit controversial, I also do see a bunch of brands rolling out this type of integration where they say that something's NFT integrated, or that there is an NFT component, or it's stored on the blockchain, and I as a consumer tap the NFC chip or scan the QR code and I can't go to the digital experience. And I will say, the only reason I'm bringing this up is not to talk shit, or excuse my French, not to speak ill of anybody, but mainly to say, if you are going to integrate something like this, or you are going to work on something like this, please just make sure it works. Because I do genuinely think that it's worse in terms of an onboarding for somebody to have one negative experience versus you just not to have it and you to just have a digital component and put it on a screen or something. So test the tech, because you don't know where you're getting these necessarily. You might be ordering them from Amazon or, I don't know, a third-party warehouse. So check. And yeah, that would be my one piece on that. I know that we're coming up to the end, and I do want to save time for questions. I do have one main thing I want to still talk about, which is the XR conversation. So maybe we can just go to this XR future slide. So bringing us home, and we'll move through the last couple slides quite quickly. But bringing us home, when we're having this conversation, obviously we just talked to Tini a little bit about how do we bring this into the physical. I also really love talking about the future in terms of this conversation, and I hope all of you do too. I think one thing I often say at the end of my conversations, but I'll say it now just to make sure that I have a chance to. In the 50s and the 60s, in the realm of like Pierre Cardin and like André Courage and like these types of designers, there was or Mugler is a perfect example. There was a penchant and there was a attraction to envisioning what the future looks like. And, I think a large part of why we have so much innovation today is very much because we had a lot of dreamers in the past who, dreamed of what does a space age look like? What does this future look like? And I'm a little bit depressed to the extent that I don't see enough people doing that today. I don't see enough people looking at what does 5, 10, 20 years in the future look like visually, aesthetically, in terms of human experience. And anytime I bring that up, I have at least one person mention to me, it's be like, because we're scared. Like, we're scared of what that looks like. We don't know what that looks like. And I'm like, okay, fair, valid. But what is the other side of that equation? If we want to have a future that isn't dystopian, that isn't taken over by AI, that isn't the Matrix, which I've had so many people bring up to me as a reference point, which I always try to swat away. If we want that, we have to envision what the alternative is. So we really have to envision what this future looks like and what we want in that future. So when we're considering the XR future, I really don't consider this to be something that's very far away. When I'm talking to, again, some of these top companies in the world, and I wish I could say names, but like the top 10 companies in the world that are relevant, that are responsible for creating the devices, let's say, that are building, this reality. There's going to be, all of there's going to be devices out next year that we will be able to use and build with. But in the next 2 to 5 years, companies are working to have consumer-facing devices available. So what that means is, in order to make that a reality, in order to make like products like Google Glasses, like the first time, I think one of the many reasons why that didn't necessarily work on a consumer level is because we need to have the world, and we need to have the context, and we need to have the content for people to experience, or else it's just not going to be that great of an experience. I think that's one of the really core parts. So I believe that rooms like this one, groups of people such as yourselves, are incredibly critical right now to brands, to the world, and I'm not hyperbolizing, because we are all the people that are going to be responsible for building this very real, very immediate future. And I do really believe that, the camp of people that come from gaming and who come from, moving towards photorealism and, doing away with, like, we don't need to store it on servers, we're going to store it on a game because we really want to focus on quality and moving things higher. Like, look at the Matrix movie and the level of, unreal CGI that's possible these days. I'm very happy that camp's continued to develop. I really see that camp tying in again with this AR camp of people who've been trying to extend reality, try to create mixed reality experience, who are pushing things like holograms. I really see this camp as well as being incredibly innovative and really facilitating what this extension of reality might look like. What I see as being this next step that I'm really encouraging and I really want to see more of are these two camps coming together and, okay, somebody's developed some of these photorealistic models. How do we take versions of them and reskin them and create lower poly versions that we can, export as GLBs and put in an AR experience? Like, how do we work together to create these extended reality experiences? And it's not just going to be one person. I have amazing conversations with architecture firms. One day I have a conversation with a traditional fashion designer. The next day I'll have meetings with, solely developers the next day, and we'll all be working towards a common goal. So I think this is really the immediate future that I want us all to kind of aspire towards. And I hope everybody has their own vision of what their brand, their ecosystem can create within this future when we really start considering beyond the limitations of the current technology that exists and what can exist in, again, as soon as 2 to 5 years. And if you have the funds and if you're able to, I'm going to push to create, and I hope many people do too, grant systems so that more people can have, for instance, the Vision Pro and can start creating in these ecosystems. I think it's incredibly important. So that's the last thing I'll end on. So I have another slide. I have another couple slides after this to say, so what? I'll ask that you just quickly run through them, actually, if that's okay, just so you can see, because I think it's cute. And then I'll end with just one point, and then I'll open it up to questions. So yeah, you can just move through these. So I had this, and then I was talking about the XR future. Here's just some little mid-journey moment. So what? I talked a little bit about that, but I'll talk about it a little more. You can just move through the next 3-4 slides. So the last thing I'll quickly mention, just in terms of the very last slide before questions, is when we're talking about these things, like I already said, really want to focus on blending these worlds together. And by that, I also mean when we blend these worlds of this XR future, and then we think of integrating Web3 technology into that future, and then we also think of integrating, the tools that are available to us today, such as AI, we're really able to create more immersive and more integrated experiences that use all of these technologies to our advantage, instead of, again, this dystopian nature or this dystopian notion that these technologies are taking advantage of us. And the last thing I'll show you, because I'm hoping we have some questions, and I'd love to continue any conversations with any of you. The last thing I'll show you is just a little mini example of this intersection. And this is just a little test that we're doing internally. But, these days, you can already have, and this is something that's available to anybody, you can go to InWorld right now and do this yourself. If you have an avatar, you can take that avatar, you can integrate it into a system, you can train an AI learning model with a personality to be integrated into that avatar, and you can have conversations with it. I can send you guys, after this, I'll send an email. I can send you guys my bot if you want to have a conversation with him, and he talks. You can have a back and forth conversation with them. And this can be integrated into a website. This can be integrated into a metaverse experience. This could also be, for all the people who bought those freaking Steve Aoki or Snoop Dogg avatars in the sandbox, for instance. This could be a use case for things like that. If you own something as well, it can be tokenized. So this is just, the direction that I very much see things going. I definitely see a lot of brands exploring these intersections right now. But again, I think that the context right now is a little bit confused, and that's really why I'm focusing on the the big picture conversation right now. Even though, again, I know that a lot of the things I mentioned today are a little bit preaching to the choir. Like, all of you know that the metaverse is important. You all know that the Vision Pro is coming out next year. But at the same time, I think that it's important that we think about this as one cohesive ecosystem, and that we work together to kind of define these things for brands in terms of what are we considering a virtual world or a metaverse? What are we considering, Web3 integration? Is AI part of Web3? These types of conversations, and really just overall try to focus on how do we use all of these technologies productively, and not just as buzzy marketing jargon type activations. So I'll end it with that. I would love if anybody has any questions or any specific things that I mentioned that you want to talk about. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but I would love to hear from all of you. And if it's okay, I'll send these slides and maybe some YouTube links and some further pieces of interest to me as a follow-up as well. So yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Appreciate you listening to my rant. I love ranting on this these days. So yeah, thoughts, questions, feelings. Did I answer? I know that there was avoid talking about Web3 versus NFT. I know that was one of the questions that came up, but hopefully I answered that. I think just to put one more point on it, I really do think it depends on the brand. I think the more traditional, the more you have to work with kid gloves in terms of bringing up any of these types of words. Imagine you mention do you want to use C++? Do you want to use C+, or do you prefer you're going to lose some people. You're just what type of experience do you want? Do you want it to move smoothly? Do you want it to have 3D elements? We just have to think a little bit more broadly. Awesome, but you're preaching to the choir. Fabulous, good. How do you position it to people with resistance? I think this is really core, and I think it's the big piece that I've had success with, honestly, especially recently, is grounding people in today. Where are we today? What are we doing today? And especially some of these statistics around, I really love pushing that 50% of the world is already in this ecosystem. We're just not on the same page in terms of nomenclature. We're not on the same page in terms of context. Two people can be developing very, very similar experiences, but will consider that they're developing almost against each other. A lot of people who are developing in a world like Decentraland might, see somebody who's developing in Fortnite as competition, when in reality, we're really both building the same future. I think also, cross-industry standards are really important, and that's something that, behind the scenes, there'll be some announcements coming in the next few months and years, but that's something that I'm also really working on, is trying to get some of these platforms on the same page. You mentioned that it was different working with big brands that already have a following than smaller ones that don't. How would a smaller brand go about gaining recognition for their NFTs besides the obvious build a following? That is a really good question, actually. I do like that a lot. I think that there's a few ways that you can go about this. I think communication, it's one of the things that we focus on very much in terms of my agency. I think communications are really key in the big picture of things. Can you create a moment that is inherently viral with the resources that you currently have that maybe a big brand wouldn't be able to? As an example of that, not to just pontificate, I think a really great example for maybe a bunch of people in this room would be those recent activations where you see, I think it's from Maybelline or Lancome, where they have those 3D rendered, moments where like a truck is driving down the street and it has like a massive lipstick or a massive like lip applicator on the back, but it's just a 3D model on a video. For a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, creating some kind of a little CG moment that's a 5 to 6 second video would probably be not that complicated, but a brand might pay $20,000 to $30,000 for that. It might be way more of a heavy lift for them to try to do that. So I'd say leaning on your skills and leaning on the tools that you have in front of you that you're able to use that a big brand might find difficulty navigating. I'd say that's my biggest recommendation. Is like what can you do that a brand would love to do? And I definitely do feel that comes in that like viral marketing moment. We have a lot of platforms now that really do facilitate these types of moments. Like, if you have a video like that, if you make some viral moment video, like you can create fashion falling out of the sky and it looks kind of real, and you share that on enough pages, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, etc., and then you share it to some feature pages. I mean, like, you'll have the same likelihood of getting featured as some of these other brands, because some of these brands send garbage content. I have to be perfectly honest. Being also somebody who works in the media, sometimes brands send bad things. If you are a lesser brand but you send something really cool that they would love to post and they think will go viral, I've seen friends of mine with like 5,000 or 6,000 followers get millions of views, just because they post a really fabulous piece of content. Love this talk so much. Thank you, Kay. So much love for you. With your knowledge of metaverse AR platforms, should digital fashion designers focus on trying to make a name for themselves in moving forwards? Okay, maybe a teeny bit of alpha. So I think, honestly, I do see a lot of value right now, and please, just come back at me with like, no, I don't want to do it. I do see a lot of value from my friends and from the people in the community who are really pushing within some of these big game ecosystems. Like, I have to say, like, Roblox has rewarded creators quite a lot. Big picture, I've seen a lot of value, monetary value even come out of that community. But at the same time, I also do see a lot of these smaller gaming worlds right now, trying to continue to be relevant. I see like Mona has done some like really amazing things in terms of creator packages and creator programs. I've seen them supporting a ton of different creators. I know they're coming from the other side of things, but I've seen Snapchat, if you actually try to push and get into their ecosystem and contact their team, I've done some work with them and I've seen them contact and support a ton of creators, like people who are creating with their tools, especially people who are creating AR tools or AR experiences, because they don't have enough people actually creating in their ecosystem right now, even though a lot of people are using their tools. I think honestly, also tagging, like, I know it sounds simple, but tagging the platforms and tagging the tools and sending your work to those tools, it may seem like you're annoying them, but really, I mean, like, we have to evangelize the ecosystem that we're building. So I think that anything that we can do to, like, I've done this, I think it's cool, share that online, and principally share it with the tools that you're using to build it. If you did something cool in Decentraland, tag Decentraland. If you did something cool, with Clo3D, tag Clo3D. Like, I think just taking that, initiative, and I have to be honest, like, that's even what I did back in, pre Web3 days. Like, when I was starting my traditional, I know we're at time, but when I was starting my agency prior to any of this, one of the first successes that I had was, I would go to influencer conferences, and I was a photographer and I was a content creator. I would go to influencer conferences and I would cold email 100 to 200 people that I knew would be at that conference, and I would get 5 to 10 responses, and I would go with those 5 to 10 people and I would make as much of an impact as I possibly could. It's like, how many editorials can we get out of this? So I would take a similar approach and try to evangelize the tools that you're using and try to work with those tools. If that wasn't taking it stage left. But cool. Thank you guys so much for this time. And if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to reach out. My social media is all the same. It's just David Cash 888. So hopefully you can find me. And I am also going to be in London, Paris, and Milan in the coming weeks. if anybody is there. And I think somebody mentioned they're in Mexico City, and I'm going to be in Mexico City the beginning of October, and LA in October as well. So wherever you guys are, let me know. Maybe I'll see you. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate everybody hanging out. And if anybody has any of those types of moments with brands where you're like, oh my God, they don't understand, again, please feel free to reach out. I think that it's a collective effort that we have to put forwards. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you all.
Thank you for the session, David. I will forward all your social media to the chat afterwards as well for anybody who wants to reach out. And I think, are you available for one-to-one mentoring or not?
I am. My schedule's a little crazy over the next few weeks, but I absolutely am. And I have a few people I'm going back and forth with, I believe, already. So
fantastic. Well, you guys can look forward to that. Thank you so much for coming to our session today, and I hope everyone has a good night or good day or morning.
Thanks, well, wherever you are in the world. If it's night, thank you for staying up. Thanks, everybody.